welcome to another episode to I'm Human Too. I'm very excited about this week's guest. We have Dimple here with us today. So I'm going to let her introduce herself, tell us who you are, what you do.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you so much for having me.
Of
Uh,
course.
my name is my name is Dimple Dhabalia. I am a writer, a podcaster, a leadership and story healing coach, a humanitarian. I feel like I wear a lot of different hats, but
Mm,
I'm also the founder of a company called Roots in the Clouds, where we're using storytelling to help individuals and leaders and organizations heal organizational trauma and moral injury. So
mm.
that's a little bit about, I guess, like the who of me.
Yeah, yeah. How did
um,
you go ahead? Go ahead.
Sorry.
Was yeah.
Um, yeah, so I spent about 20 years in the U.S. government working on asylum and refugee policies and operations.
Mm,
So in that role, I started out as an asylum officer, actually interviewing asylum applicants in the U.S.
mm,
And then I spent a good chunk of my career traveling all over the world interviewing refugees for resettlement in the US. And as a result of that, and so I did a lot of like work in the field, and then in between, I'd kind of flip back and forth between that and then leadership roles back at headquarters and then back out in the field. And over the course of my career, I started to experience a lot of different, what I call occupational traumas. So things like vicarious trauma, secondary traumatic stress, compassion fatigue, moral injury, and then, of course, just traditional burnout.
mhm.
And what I found was that nobody was really talking about any of that in the workplace. And so for me, what it meant was, as I was looking around at my colleagues, I thought, oh, everybody else can handle this job, and there must be something wrong with me. And it's just because we weren't talking about it. And so it led to a lot of shame and a lot of me feeling like something was wrong with me and that I needed to fix myself, um, and then as I started to kind of look into what I was experiencing, and what really happened for me is when I started my career, I'm actually a lawyer by training, and so
Okay.
my first job out of law school was with the Attorney General's office in Denver, Colorado.
Mhm.
And in that job, we actually did a lot of work around child abuse and neglect. And
Mm,
I had an incredible boss who recognized that this kind of work where we're serving kind of vulnerable populations can have a real impact on those of us doing the work. And so he used to make us go through this annual vicarious trauma training. And
good.
as a brand new attorney, I was like, I don't know why we need this. I don't understand what we're doing. And what was interesting was that it planted some seeds for me. Um, and so those seeds actually came to fruition a full decade later when I was posted in Zambia
Mm,
to interview refugees, and it was really interesting because it was one of the worst trips I'd ever been on.
mm,
The caseload itself was just incredibly challenging. Just about every case that we interviewed had stories of rape as a tool of war,
mhm.
and just um, the levels of violence that we heard about were just, I mean, more than I had ever heard in the whole time I'd been doing the work. And so
Mm,
it was the first time in my career where I started to really struggle to regulate my emotions. So I'd be in interviews with applicants, and I had taken pride up until then to be able to create what I called a wall of professionalism.
yes.
And that wall just really came crumbling down. And I was crying as people were telling me their stories. I would, go back to the hotel after work, and all of us would just head straight to the bar. And I couldn't
Mhm.
sleep at night, or if I did, I was having really horrific nightmares where I was reliving the stories that I had heard during the day. And so
Mhm.
all of this was just, it was so painful. And it wasn't until I got home from that trip that the words vicarious trauma started floating around in my head. And so
Mm.
those seeds that had been planted kind of came back, and I was like, oh, let me look this up. And so as I started doing some research, I realized, okay, this is pretty common in this line of work. So I'm definitely not the only one experiencing it. But then that made me wonder, well, so then why aren't we talking about it?
Yeah.
And so after that kind of, at that time, I was actually posted at the embassy in Athens, Greece. And so I was traveling out to different places to interview refugees. So once my tour in Athens ended and I came back to the US, I really started advocating from within my organization that we needed to start talking about these traumas that are very a real part of this kind of work, so that we can normalize it and start taking away the stigma associated with it, and actually help people in this line of work take care of themselves so that they can keep doing the work. Because I think those of us who take on these kinds of careers really want to we want to serve in this way,
Mm.
and when we are unable to, it's really devastating. And so yeah, so that's that's the very long version of kind of how I ended up here. And so I took all of that and I put it in a book that I recently published called Tell Me My Story, Challenging the Narrative of Service Before Self, which was just published this
Mm.
past February. So
Congratulations.
thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. And I 100%, when yeah, I, yeah, your story resonates with like my experience, and I'm sure so many other people's and providers and helpers and community service workers experiences. And we are asked to hold a lot. And so when we can't maybe access the coping or the support or the healing that we need to in order to be able to continue and sustain the work we do, we crumble, right? And that's what trauma does, is it creates a scattering in the brain and a scattering in the nervous system, and we become uncontained, where that wall of professionalism that you talked about crumbles. And it always crumbles in the least convenient time, in the least convenient way. And then, right,
Exactly. Yeah.
like, I'm so glad that you had those early seeds of understanding what was really happening with you. Um, yeah, because what you were asked to hold is so sacred and yet so heavy and so sad. And it's not just mentally holding, but your body was holding, as they would share, for sure. And yeah, when I was in my practicum, I worked with refugees, and there is no container. There is no lineation between you and them. It's like they're so desperate to share and to tell and to be heard and to be seen and to get needs met on any level, just because of the amount of trauma. Um, it can be debilitating, for those who are constantly in it. Yeah, and
Yeah.
I don't know how you did 20 years of that. Like, good Lord. Yeah, but
Well, lucky for me, it wasn't 20 straight years. Like I said,
yeah.
I'd be in the field for like 2 or 3 years, and then I would
Mm,
step back out. And that is probably really what saved me in the long run,
yeah.
because yeah, you're right. Like it is a lot. And, I think, to your point, the people sitting in front of us, they just want to feel seen and heard.
Yes.
Um, what was interesting for me is what I realized many years later, like really actually when I started writing the book, was a big part of what I didn't realize is that, well, I do think, and I've thought this for a long time, that those of us who choose these kinds of career paths have usually experienced some kind of trauma in our own lives at a young age, right?
Mm,
Or at some point in our lives. And
mhm,
we tend to go down these paths because we want to give back in some way, because somebody
mhm,
helped us or we saw where there was a need. But in this particular line of work, what was really interesting as I started writing the book was I realized that every time I sat down with an applicant and sat with them in their trauma, I was actually sitting back in my own trauma of things that had
yes.
happened in my life growing up. And
Mhm,
because I didn't have that awareness at the time, I didn't know how to protect myself. And you're 100% right in terms of like how the trauma settles in our body, right? And
mhm,
so I'm always fascinated. Like I really want to figure out how to do some kind of a study of people in these kinds of frontline work because the levels of like autoimmune issues
Oh,
and
yeah.
inflammation and other kind of
Mhm.
chronic diseases that people in this line of work experience. Like I'm always a little bit in like surprised but not surprised when I
Mhm.
meet people doing this work and they talk about, oh yeah, I have thyroid or I have this or I have that. You know, I have a lot of people now with different forms of like rheumatoid arthritis and things like that. And
Mhm.
I think that we like in the Western world, we're not making that connection between the
Mhm.
stress and trauma that we're taking on through our work and how that's then turning into these kinds of issues in our body. So yeah, I think that's a
Yeah.
big part of it.
Yeah. Absolutely. And one of the biggest things that I talk about is, right, this word like disease, like dis-ease.
This is, yeah,
Like when we feel unsettled in our body, like that creates dis-ease in our body. Um, and I think it's right, it's kind of that thing of like, well, I can keep going, I can tough it out, I'm resilient, I'm strong enough. Like we hold all of these beliefs around not being good enough or not having the time or space to crumble or self-care is selfish or yeah, even the reenactment of our own trauma. Like so to be able to step back and say, how is this sitting within me? How am I maybe hurting myself? How am I self-abandoning? I mean, definitely a privilege for sure, but also essential in keeping a healthy body because it's even when I worked alongside refugees, so often there would be so much happening for them medically, and not just
yeah,
because of the physical medical neglect that they have endured over years, whether it's like not having access or simply not knowing or even just like culturally not appropriate. But the trauma, right? Like so much chronic pain, so much disease, so much, even like things like diabetes. And, there's so much disconnection from health when you're in survival and when you're in things like active war. It's something that our culture here in America can never understand. Like on any level, the threat of just surviving. Even our levels of poverty are so different from levels of
yes.
poverty abroad. And so, yeah, being able to really sit in the conversation around like how your trauma has impacted your physical body, like,
And
yeah, it's wild.
I don't I don't know if you've noticed this in your work, but like in my work, especially with organizations, like people are really uncomfortable with the word trauma, right? Because we equate, I mean, 100% most of us will wear stress as a badge of honor, right? Like, oh my gosh, it just because stress seems to imply like, oh, I'm busy and I'm important and I've got all these things I need to do. But trauma, we've historically equated with shame. And so it's really an interesting thing to be talking about trauma, especially in, for me at least, in the workplace, and getting people to understand that when we're talking about trauma, we're really talking about like a lot of this is, they are nervous system reactions, right? Like how
Mhm.
we are. How our nervous system is being activated and staying activated. And, I often will talk about how you can have 10 people in the room who all experience the same event, and you'll have 10 different responses because people have like that window of tolerance to stress and trauma. And so, depending on the things that have happened in your own life, this determines how wide or narrow our window of tolerance is to what we're experiencing, and ultimately how we're going to react. And so this is how I try to help kind of normalize this for people so that they're not feeling like, oh, okay, if I'm experiencing trauma, it's this bad thing and there's something wrong with me. And I think the other piece of this also is helping to kind of create that understanding of like the big T and little t traumas, right? There's things that
Mhm.
are happening in our life every day that we don't think about as trauma necessarily, I think most of us go through the world thinking about big things like natural disasters or physical or sexual assaults or things like that as being trauma. And
Mhm.
we downplay the other things like you're talking about, like poverty is a really big little t trauma, right? That whether we're experiencing it, whether we're seeing it every day. Like I used to live in Oakland and I had to move out of the Bay Area because I just really had such a hard time witnessing, how people were being treated, especially unhoused people were being treated. And it really impacted me a lot, what I would be taking in what I was witnessing. And so
Mhm.
even, we can experience that vicariously as well. And so understanding that there are so many of these little t traumas that we are experiencing on a regular basis. And when those start building up, if we're not tending to them, and we're not practicing self-care. And yeah, I talk, like with self-care is another area that I really look at as like, I think we need to change how we're looking at it because it has historically been tied to, luxury and indulgence. And but self-care, again, I really look at it as how do we regulate our nervous systems in real time, right? So
Mhm.
how, like, what is actually what is it that needs tending, whether it's like my physical health or something emotional, and finding things in the moment that I can do to get myself back into a better place, with my nervous system. And so all of these things I think is just, how we're educating people and like helping them understand that this is, again, I love the title of I'm Human Too, because
Mm.
my tagline is putting the human back into humanitarian work because, again,
Mm.
I think those of us out here doing the work, people forget that we are human at our core, and
Mhm.
that these are the things that they're all human experiences. And I always laugh about like the industrial revolution. One of the biggest, things coming out of the industrial revolution was to create efficiency and create, standardized like practices and stuff.
Mhm.
The problem is that they took that model and they applied it across the board to every sector. And when
Mhm.
you're in the business of serving other human beings, that process doesn't work, or like that
No.
way of working doesn't work, right? And
Yeah.
instead, what it's done is like removed our humanity, because now it's like the industrial revolution created like the start and end times for work and the times we're supposed to eat. And so we don't listen to our bodies anymore. We don't notice when is like my actual peak performance. It might not be at 8 a.m. It might
Yes.
be
Yeah.
later in the day. And so things like that, I think that we really have to like keep bringing light to the fact that as human beings we weren't meant to fit into these boxes, and this is
Mhm.
part of like why some of us do better in certain situations than others. And that doesn't mean that we're lacking or that there's something wrong with us. It's just that we don't operate in the way that this kind of colonial mindset of how we should be. It doesn't always work for the rest of us.
Yeah. And that really, I mean, yeah, that starts with decolonizing and the removal of shame, right? And the removal of
Yeah.
expectation of who you should be or how you should be operating, right? And all of the self-beliefs of if I step out of this colonial construct, am I a failure? Right? Am I
Yeah.
not doing enough? Am I not good enough? Like I should be tougher, I should be stronger. Like really giving space and time to allow growth in those areas and kind of stepping out of your ego.
Yeah.
um and I think when you can recognize like I am a human and that means that I'm going to have ups and downs and shitty days and great days, and I can hold certain things at times and I can't others. Like I'm okay regardless, right? This
Yeah.
system that's like I'm a cog in the machine isn't going to fail if I step out for a year, if I step out for an hour,
Yep.
to take care of myself. We really need to step out of the ego of being a community worker. And even
Hmm.
in the mental health field, it's insane. Like, I started an agency, and it's like y- y- the workload, the caseload. When I first got started, I worked a lot with CPS involved families and trauma and neglect, and it hit my story, like
Yeah,
I was a foster care kid, like just every and right, you step back into it because you're like, oh, I want to make a difference in the next generation, and I want to heal the things that I still hurt from, and I want to heal my own wounding. And it's like, yes, and you're re-traumatizing. And so even having that
yeah,
realization of no, like if I'm going to do different, then I have to be different in a way, and I have to treat myself different. I have to
yeah,
want different for my nervous system and my body and my brain and my spirit.
yeah,
And that's okay. Like I'm doing what wasn't given to me, or I'm doing what my parents couldn't do for me, or what they couldn't do for themselves, or their grandparents, right? That intergenerational trauma
yeah,
um, is so important and crucial when you're a helper or a healer. And, I mean, I still have this conversation with other clinicians where it's like, what are we doing? Like,
yeah,
what are
yeah,
the choices we're making and why? Is it about who you want to be in the system, or is it about you and your own wounding? And they're like, well, like, I should be able to do 20 hours a week. And it's like, but you can't. You're telling me you can't, and that's okay. So,
yeah.
like, how can we care for ourselves? And
Well, I always say should is the red flag there. Anytime the word should
yes.
starts to pop up, like,
Yeah.
we need to stop shoulding all over ourselves, right? So, yeah, should is always like that keyword right there.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. And yeah, that's why like I'm human too, is because it's like, even in the community helper role, like you are still a human. Like, how do we put the human back in humanitarianism? It's not by gritting your teeth and, shooting all over yourself, like,
Yeah.
because then you can't show up for the people that are needing you to show up, and you can't show up for you in the way that will be healthy and safe for you. So,
Yeah.
100% agree.
Yeah. But the thing is, like, we're so conditioned, right? We've been conditioned for
Hmm.
generations now
Hmm.
that this is the way it's supposed to be. And so I agree
Hmm.
with you, like, taking our ego out of it and also recognizing or redefining metrics of success, right? What does it
Hmm.
mean to be successful? And it is hard. Like, I'm out here doing this work and I still get caught up in this feeling of like, oh, do I have enough clients? Am I out there speaking enough? Am I doing enough on social media? And so again, it all goes back to that feeling of not enough. But that
Hmm.
feeling of not enough has been baked into our culture
Hmm.
in a way that's so unhealthy. And
Hmm.
the other thing, that you brought up, which I think is interesting, is, I think there's a fine line between stepping out of our ego and then having, like, I think a lot of times, I'm really careful because I don't want people to hear me speak and think like, oh yeah, you have the privilege to be able to do that. It must be really nice. And I recognize that I do have a lot of privilege. So I 100% recognize that. But what I say to people who may not be in the position to take a year off or to leave a job, with that's in a toxic workplace, is that there are still little choices that we can make even in those scenarios
Hmm.
to take care of ourselves. Like I call them little acts of resistance, right?
Hmm.
Where we can make those choices. But again, because we're so tied to, well, what's my boss going to think? What's the organization going to think? Are they going to, which we know from our work is these are all nervous system responses. And so, like in my work, I talk about how, so we have our shaping stories. And so these are all the experiences that we've had since childhood that have shaped the lens through which we see and experience the world. And so
Hmm.
they've really influenced who we have become. And those shaping stories relate directly to our surviving stories. And so our surviving stories are, we've all heard of fight or flight and freeze. But I also
And
talk about,
fun.
right. And so I actually talk about fix and fake. And like,
Mm.
so the way that these show up I think a lot of times people don't realize, like, fight shows up as blame, as criticism, as judgment, as violence. And all of these things can be directed outwards towards others or inwards towards ourselves. Flight is, anything to avoid our emotions or what we're experiencing, right? So again, it could be getting up and walking out, or what we see more often, though, is this is where we see a lot of addictions happening. This is where we see the workaholism, the alcoholism. This is where we see binge watching hours of television during
Doom
COVID,
scrolling.
doom
Yeah.
scrolling, exactly. And this is where we see that people have a hard time connecting with others as well. And
Hmm.
then freeze is that paralysis by analysis where we're stuck and we can't really move forward or make decisions. And
Hmm.
then fix and fake, though. So fix is the one for me, at least, that's really born out of this desire to be enough. And so it's this like if then game that we play with ourselves, right? So,
Yes.
well, but if I am more productive, then my manager will think that I'm more valuable or worthy of that promotion or whatever.
Hmm.
And so all of this is designed to make us feel like, okay, if I can do this, then I'll be worthy, right?
Yes.
And we
Yes.
never get there, though, because it's
No.
this constant
No.
pattern of like this nervous system reaction that never gets addressed. And
Yeah.
then fake is just, it's perfectionism. It's
Mhm.
this feeling like I can't be vulnerable. I can't show that I don't know what I'm doing.
Mhm.
Especially for leaders, like fake is such a big nervous system reaction that they
Mhm.
are constant, like most leaders don't want to say I don't know, or
Oh, yeah.
or rely on someone else's, like to be like, oh yeah, you know what, that was great, I didn't know that.
Mhm.
But because we think like, oh, this means people are going to look at us like we don't know what we're talking about, or and
Mhm.
again, that I'm not worthy of being in this position. And
Mhm.
so we put on these masks and we hide behind these masks. And it's, again, it's just, you can't, it's not sustainable over the course of a career. And so
No.
this is where we see people start to break down along the way. And whether it's because, like you're taking it out on your friends and family or on your colleagues or whatever, it comes out, as you said. And so it's not like, I'm just going to
No.
wear this mask forever and I'm going to move through life and it's going to be great. It's going to be so painful. And so this is why, like, we have to actually understand like what our patterns are and
Mhm.
start to develop awareness around them, develop compassion around them, so that we can actually start to regulate in real time more often.
Mhm.
Because we notice when these same stories are coming up for us, and we can actually pause, we can take a breath, we can break that cycle and make a different choice, right?
Mhm. Yeah. And I think it's imperative that that is modeled for you. Like, right, that trauma of like,
Yes.
well, I know it, like cognitively, like I know the things, right? But having someone in it with you to
Hmm.
create space for you to even figure out like what those responses are or what those belief systems are, how your body's holding it, right? Someone to give you that self-compassion when you're not in the space of doing it, or someone seeing you in your pain, right? Or creating
Yep.
space for that vulnerability if you can't go there. And that's where the trauma wants you to isolate. The trauma, right, has all of these wonderful responses that are highly protective and help you function, right? Like all of those responses aren't
Yep.
bad responses. They're actually really good. They're really protective. They get you into the places that you want and need to be, right? So it's not even taking those pieces away or healing those parts of you out, but it's more how can we create more acceptance and less resistance in those movements to change and grow and heal. And that begins with relationship and with modeling and with someone else extending
Hmm.
and showing and providing those things for you, your brain and your body, when you can't have those internally, starting with you. So it's like
Yep.
that's where it's yeah, I find so much power in leaning into the community that has an idea of what is maybe wanted or needed, even though it's really scary. But like also part of that
Yeah.
ego and that shame of like, well, I have to do it. Like, yes, I have all of these trauma symptoms and I have to figure it out myself and I have to read books and I have to listen to podcasts and I have to go, go, go. It's just another form of that. So even
Yes.
like, creating space of slowing down and recognizing where you are and not making it a race, not making it another thing that's an expectation on your plate of like, well, if I have a flight response, I know better and I should be doing different. Like, no, bitch, you're okay to be where you are. Take a breath. Like, call a friend, take a bath, go for a
Yeah.
walk. Like, you're not
It,
alone in it, and there's no judgment. There's no
yeah,
shame in those responses. Your body's actually doing what it's wired to do, and it's okay.
exactly.
There's a
Exactly.
different path eventually, and you'll
Yeah.
get there if you want to be there,
Yeah.
trusting your body and brain to heal in its
Yeah.
own timing and its own pacing.
Yeah.
Like,
But
you
it's
know,
so funny. Like I love that. And it's so true, right? Because I think that there's so many times where I just actually wrote an essay about this that one of the things I promised myself in leaving my job after 20 years was that number one, I wasn't going to use an alarm clock anymore, which I don't.
I wish that's like
And
the thing to aspire
I
to.
know. And so it's lovely. I get up when my body's ready to get up. And again, I know I'm privileged to do that. But the other thing I really wanted to build in was time off. So I wanted to be able to take a month off in the summer and a month off at the holidays and like in the winter. And so I did it for the first time this summer. And
Congratulations.
well, wait till you hear the rest of the
Oh,
story. So
it's a work
and
in
so
progress.
it's a work in progress. Um, and so I told myself, like, okay, this month is just going to be like self care. I'm going to relax. I'm going to, just like not really do anything. And what I found was pretty soon my calendar was filled with like appointments and, like, I mean, like, oh, I'm going to go to the acupuncturist. I'm going to go get a massage. And after like about 2 weeks, I was sitting there and I was like, huh. So I've traded in like one form of productivity for another, like
Yeah.
under the guise of self care,
Yeah.
right? Like just the thought of just sitting on my sofa or going for a walk with like no time limit, nothing that I have to be doing. It's scary,
Mhm.
right? Like it's just we don't operate that way because again, we've been taught that we need to be busy and it is so jarring to like just be like, no, I'm not going to do anything, and then your brain's like, oh, want to bet? I'm going
Oh
to
yeah.
sneak it in another way.
Oh yeah. I've had to like physically put myself in places where like I don't have access to anything. Like not my
Yeah,
phone, not Wi-Fi,
yeah.
not internet, like and I just did that this summer. Like me and my husband went to Wyoming and like
Oh,
there's
that must have been
no
nice.
even in the town, there's no Wi-Fi. And like my brain is still like, you have to check your email. You have to like da da da. And it's like, no. Like, and I know that about myself.
Yeah,
And so even just having compassion of like, of course you want to check your email. Like you still have those obligations and you're anxious about going back to the obligations when this week is over.
yeah,
But like, and you still have 3 more days. So like, let's reset and allow
yeah,
ourselves to be disconnected. Like take a breath, like
yeah,
go find a distraction, go like sit with a flower, go sit with a tree. Like,
yeah,
and it has taken me, 10 years of being in this field to even be able to do that without
yeah,
shame,
yeah,
and still sometimes the shame pops up. So,
yeah.
like, all that
And
to say, yeah,
and the
we do
physical
that.
reaction, right? Like
Oh,
um
yeah.
in 2015, I write about this in my book. I share this story about how I was I was the field office director in New Delhi at the
Mm.
immigration office there, and I got sick like within I think a week of sorry,
No, don't
within like
apologize.
within
Take
like a
some
week.
water. What do you need? What does your body need,
You're
Dimple?
right. What does my body need right now?
Yes.
Um,
Mm.
yeah, so like within a week of getting to New Delhi, I I got sick. Like I just started getting these weird rashes on my legs and I was like, what is going on? And I kept going, and I was traveling so much though for work in the region, and it was the height of the refugee crisis. So, in addition to running what was the largest office that we had overseas, I was like leaving for 2 weeks at a time. And when I came back, I'd have stacks of files that I needed to review for work that had been done in my office while I was gone. And so I had no social support, no life outside of work,
Mm,
and I would go to the med unit in between trips, and they'd be like, well, maybe you ate something, and I'm like, no, like I knew my body, and I was like, that's not what this is. But nobody could figure it out. And
mm,
so almost like a full year went by like this, and I finally went home for the first time, and my doctor was like, and I have this amazing doctor here. He's this functional medicine guy. He looks at the
mm.
whole person,
Nice.
and he took one look and he was just like, you need to get out of this job. And I was like, what are you talking about? And
Mm,
he's like, your body at this point is literally attacking itself. This is what
mm,
this is. It's like it's giving you other signs that you've ignored, and now it's telling you like this is the next step. And
yeah.
I was just like, I just got there, like I can't turn around and leave now, and and all this.
Mhm.
And he was like, okay, well, you can either come back now or maybe you don't come back at all. And I was like, what? And
Yeah.
so it was like, and in the meantime, New Delhi pollution is horrific. And so my lungs had also started to suffer. And so
Mm,
I finally made the choice. It should have been a no-brainer, but it took me 3 days to finally talk to my management about, I need to curtail and go home. And they were very supportive,
good.
which was good. Yeah. But when I finished my assignment, since I was in India, I decided there's a thing called panchkarma
Mm,
that we do in India, which is like a whole body healing. It's Ayurvedic based, and
mm,
it's incredible. And so all through South India, there's a lot of these places where you can go and get panchkarma. And so I
mm.
decided to do it for 3 weeks, and my mom came out to do it with me.
Wow.
And it was the first time in like 15 years of working that I had no equipment. Like I had no computer. They had taken away my phone because, or I mean, I had turned my phone in because I had left the position. And I didn't have a personal cell phone at that point that worked in India.
Mhm.
And like I had not, and then like you said, they didn't have Wi-Fi there, and no televisions or anything like that. And in fact, with Panchakarma, they tell you that you should, the idea is to disconnect from all of these things and focus on reading if you want to, like light things that are uplifting and like spiritual.
Mm,
And they look at like your doshas. So there's this whole like scientific system that they use to figure out. So they make all your meals based on what your needs are. They
wow.
adjust all your treatments based on what your needs are. And so what was really fascinating was after the first week of being there, and I did like every day I'd be reaching for my phone, and I was like, oh, I don't have a phone to
Mhm,
reach for.
mhm.
And it was so interesting. And after the first week, like I was able to start letting go of that. I was writing more, and actually sleeping. Like I was taking naps and letting my body
Mm,
actually like rest and heal, which it hadn't been able to do in 15 years.
yeah.
And I was swimming, and we were right on the ocean. And so the first week, to get to the ocean, you had to walk down all these stairs. And I remember telling my mom, I was like, I don't know how I'm going to get back up here. And she's like, well, we'll go slow. It'll be fine. By the end of the first week, like I had no problem going up and down. Like my lungs had cleared, and like
Wow.
it was incredible, and
Yeah.
it was just after 1 week. And so at the end of 3 weeks, I was like a
Mhm.
whole new person. Like
Yeah,
I was,
which speaks
you
to
know,
like the strength of our body.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. If we give it the time and the space and
Yes.
the,
The
and again, I
support.
know in support, yeah. And even if we don't have 3 weeks available to us, even taking a day or half a day or something to just focus on, and it like like this moment was the perfect example. What does my body need in this moment? And
Mhm.
starting to create those new neural pathways to help us recognize that more often, so that we can tend to ourselves in real time rather than feeling like self-care has to be this big, like, oh, I have to go take 3 weeks and go do this thing. But no, really, like I can take 3 minutes right now and grab some water and maybe take a few deep breaths, and and all of these things help us reset, right?
Yeah, yeah, that's incredible. I'm really glad that you had someone who told you not what you wanted to hear, but what you needed to hear, and then you had the support to take that time to really heal and look at and evaluate um, what what your body needed on a literal cellular level, what your
Yeah.
brain needed. I mean, that's yeah, not most people don't have 3 weeks, and there is a lot of privilege. And, I do the same thing where it's like I'm very protective around my time off, because without it, I literally can't function in what I do.
Hmm.
um, so, but I do recognize it's a privilege, and it's a privilege that like we haven't always had. Like, I mean, being further along in the field, like you have more sometimes autonomy and power and control and a different level of awareness and self-reflection, just even doing that self-growth piece.
But wouldn't it
Um,
be
you
amazing
know.
if this was like normalized in these fields?
Hmm.
Like, you work a certain amount of time and then
Yeah.
you get, 3 weeks or a month off, or whatever, or sabbaticals,
Yes.
some organizations provide those, but they are not a regular thing. Like they're really rare, I think. But I mean, I
Hmm.
think if organizations, a lot of times I feel like in these lines of work, like I talk a lot about how the ethos of care and concern that's given to the people we're serving isn't always given to the people doing the work. And if
Oh,
we were able to
yeah.
shift, right? If we were able to
Hmm.
shift that and actually create space for that, we're like, that's the long game. Because like you said, I think, people, we want to be doing this work, but if we get to the point where we can't, like you're losing people. But if you invest a little bit of time and energy and money into creating this kind of space in these human related services, you're going to retain people for so much longer, and they're going to be happy and healthy and able to then serve in a way that, these like everyone's so overworked right now. And
Yes.
and it
And that
and
starts in leadership.
100%. And then that trickles down in terms of
Yeah.
how we treat people, because these overworked leaders are not often kind to their people. And then, I mean, some of them are, but the majority are not. And then that then trickles out to the people you're serving too, where,
Mhm.
I've heard people interviewing asylum seekers and refugees and just being so, like, I've had to call people out at times to be like, what are you doing? Like, this is not
Mhm.
okay.
Mhm.
You can't talk to people this way. And so
Yeah.
again, we lose that sense of seeing each other's humanity,
Mhm.
and and that reminder that I'm human too.
Oh, yeah.
And so yeah.
Yeah. One of my favorite books that I didn't like for a very long time because I had been experiencing a lot of burnout, a lot of vicarious trauma, a lot of my own re-traumatization at the time. And I went and saw a therapist, and she's like, I think you're burnt out. And I was like, fuck you. Um, so,
Yeah.
but she was like, okay, well, if you're willing, just read this book. It's called Trauma Stewardship. And I was
Oh
like,
yeah, it's such a
yeah,
good
yeah,
book.
yeah, whatever. Right. It took me like 6 months to read it, but I read that book and I was like, oh, that's like me and every coworker in
Yeah.
this community health agency. And like, I need to do something about it.
Yeah.
So I ended up going back and be like, that book that you recommended, I think that I might be experienced and I owe you an apology, like, um, but it is like even some of those symptoms of like callousness when you're working with people or
Yeah.
joking about horrendously traumatizing
Dark
content.
humor.
Like, yes. And then it's like, oh, well, that's the only way that I can get through it. And it's like, yes. And there's something like
Yeah.
horribly sad about that because you're not receiving the support and the care that you should from leadership. And, even as I grow my own practice, it's like, it's not that I want to do better. It's like I have to do better. Like failing at
Exactly.
doing different is not a fucking option. Like
Yeah.
because I've been there. I know what it feels like. It's so harmful. It's so traumatizing. So like that piece in leadership of like being able to say, I don't know, and I'm going to go learn, or I'm going to go get you the support that you need, or I'm going to figure out what's happening in me so that you can get your needs met. Like having that ability to step back and say, like, I'm not the expert, right?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
I'm one person and
Yeah.
you're having an experience and we just need to figure out how to support you in that.
Mhm.
And because I've had employers or leadership that says like, right, they do the whole gaslighting of like, we care for you, like we want to support you, but we can't give you health benefits, or but we can't pay you a livable wage, or but we,
Yeah.
and I've
Yeah.
had so many employers like violate labor laws, and it's
Yeah.
like, well, all you have to do is your due diligence. Like it's not rocket science, or call in an expert on that, or do a safety consult, or
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
so it
That's how oh, sorry.
totally starts with leadership. Sorry, I'm on a tangent.
No,
You
no.
got me all riled up.
Yeah, look, I mean, we're on the same page here. I agree that it starts with leadership. And I often say that it's often like your mid-level managers, your first and second line kind of supervisors, I call them leaders as well. Like that's the
Mhm,
other thing. Like I think the words we use are important because a lot of time, they're referred to as supervisors and only executives are referred to as leaders. And it's like, well, no, like these people are leading as well, but we're not giving them the tools to do so.
mhm,
And the leadership programs that I've created have always been aimed at that mid-level because I think that they're in the best position to affect change both up and down the ladder kind of, right?
mhm,
And so I created this program when I was in the government. It was the first program in our agency that was um, based in mindful performance and positive psychology. And we we launched 2 weeks before COVID shutdown happened. That was totally,
mm.
we had no
Oh my
idea that was
gosh.
coming.
Yeah.
What was fascinating though is so the whole program was really focused on helping these leaders learn about themselves. So we were really
Mm,
teaching them about self-awareness. We were teaching them about self-compassion. We were teaching them about self-regulation with the understanding that this would then move into how they worked with their teams. And we were tracking our metrics in terms of like how through 360 surveys to see how they were doing along the way. And what we found at the end of a year, at the end of the first year of COVID, so over a year after the program, was that the teams that had leaders that went through our program came out of that first year of COVID as tight units where they were
mm,
supporting each other. They were in good spirits, and they were working through things together. Whereas that
mm,
was not the experience for the bulk of our agency. For the bulk of our agency, because first of all, senior leaders were focused on productivity. They were like, "Oh,
mhm.
people are at home. We can heighten these productivity measures." And I was like,
Yeah.
really? Like people are traumatized right now. Like they are trying to navigate all these people at home and homeschool
Mhm,
kids and all this stuff, or the opposite extreme of being totally isolated, which is
mhm,
also incredibly challenging. And
mhm.
you're worrying about upping your numbers right now. Like that doesn't really make sense to me. And so I found that really, really, really frustrating. And that's the other thing, like in all of this work, like I'm really looking at I or advocating for duty of care. And like, historically, organizations in our lines of work, their duty of care has been solely focused on like legal, the legal duty of care in terms of ensuring a safe workplace,
Mhm,
sort of, right? um, but I think that there's a moral obligation for leaders and organizations to be providing a holistic, human centered duty of care that
mhm,
looks at all aspects of the human being, right? The mental, the physical, the emotional, the spiritual, the relational. And again, I was on a podcast recently and the guy was like, well, so, are you saying that like we need to just be in therapy at work all the time? And, isn't the workplace going to turn into just therapy? And I said, no, that's not at
mm,
all what's going to happen. But if we start to understand that, again, we don't compartmentalize, even though this is what is expected of us. We
Mm,
really can't. We're whole human beings. We don't leave a piece of ourselves at the door. So
mhm.
if we can start to recognize that this is a whole human, so what are their needs? We can start to come up with ways in our workplaces to actually create space to address these very real human needs and allow humans to be humans so that they can then function from that place instead of trying to like shove down emotions, which is then creating issues in their bodies, you know,
Yeah.
or issues in their relationships.
Mhm.
And instead, like allow them to be able to show up and be the best versions of themselves. And so I think like this
Yeah.
is a really important piece of it. And leaders are definitely where it starts, because if they're not modeling good behavior, or they're sending emails at 2 in the morning, or or whatever, then
Mhm.
that's the tone that you're setting for everybody else. And people think like, oh,
Yeah.
okay, if I am not available 24/7, then that's going to become a problem. And
Yeah.
like, it's very rare. I know a lot of our work, especially when we're dealing with humans, it does impact other humans' lives, but
Mhm.
rarely is it life and death in that moment. And
Yes.
you know what, you can log off at 6 at the latest and actually
Yeah.
have an evening of doing other things, and you should be
Mhm.
doing other things. Sorry, I'm using the word should, but we need, our brains need that break away
Mhm.
from it to be, to have other connections and other things that are important. And so,
Mhm. Mhm. And it's
all right,
okay to expect that for yourself,
exactly,
you
exactly,
know? So,
yeah.
yeah. Yeah. I agree. I agree. Like, and I think really it's about being attuned to your staff and attuning to what the needs actually are and not assuming what the needs are based on your capacity or your budget or whatever that is. Like
Or
having
your
an
own lens.
yes, having like an employee centered approach around even culture,
Yeah.
offering so it starts with that self-reflection and self-awareness and growth and yeah, absolutely 100%. So, well, where can people find you? They want to follow up if they want to learn more. I know where you're going to be the last weekend of September.
Yeah, I'm excited about that.
Yes.
Um, yeah, so my company is called Roots in the Clouds. That's all plural. So rootsintheclouds.com. Or you can follow me at Dimpstory, Dimpstory, across all social media platforms, or at Dear Humanitarian on Substack. So,
Okay.
oh,
Awesome.
actually, and if I can just say one more thing,
Go for it.
in addition to the book, I did launch a limited series podcast called Service Without Sacrifice.
That's exciting.
Yeah, and so it corresponds with the different parts of the book. So I hope people will definitely check that out as well. And I have another podcast called What Would Ted Lasso Do, which is just more fun, but it's also about leadership. So I'll just plug
I
both of those.
love it. So go listen. We'll link it in this episode so that you can find all of this good stuff. Um, and yes, I am very excited to meet you in person.
Me too.
Yes. So I hope you have a wonderful couple of weeks and I'll see you soon. And
Yeah.
to everyone listening in, thank you so much. You absolutely have the ability and power to question and be curious about what it is you're needing and wanting in a workplace, as an employee, as a human. So I hope that you leave and feel like you can take a big deep breath and get curious. Have a good day. Bye.